Thank you.
Good morning. For those of you who have not been with us that often, a while back, I came to realize and appreciate a quote, which it's an unknown individual, but it says, "Dead people receive more flowers than living ones because regret is stronger than gratitude." And that's a negative way of saying, show people that you appreciate them while they're alive. And so I just bring that up because every time I get up here, I give a few flowers, and that sounds weird if you don't have any context. But some flowers this morning that I want to make sure I give. Jeremy Hopper. He has been a help coordinator, especially for the Hodge family, but even more than that. But I especially appreciate that, I don't know if he heard the advice or just common sense told him, but he started reaching out directly to people. How many people have received a text specifically just to you, hey, we're doing this, can you help, right? I'm one of them. I really appreciate that. Leadership principles will tell you, you go directly to somebody and ask for help is going to get a lot more response than sending out big emails or memos. So I appreciate all that Jeremy's done, and especially that approach to getting people involved. And then, of course, all our teachers for our children's classes, I appreciate all of you, but I want to mention two people specifically, Becca and Catalina, two of our students. And I just appreciate the fact that you're getting involved, you're a part of the family, and you're serving, not just someone watching things go by, but students, we have lots of opportunities to be involved, and I hope that Catalina and Becca will be an encouragement to you on how you're involved. I'm going to start by sharing a few pictures, asking a few questions and sharing a few pictures. These are going to be weird questions. What do you think of when I say popsicle? Most of you are thinking, I don't think of anything when you say popsicle. I think about a popsicle. I think about Disney World when I think about popsicles. Because, aren't they cute? I did not ask permission. I still pay for their lives, so I don't think I have to yet. Popsicles. Why Disney World? Because back when we first took the two oldest to Disney World, Natalie especially was under very strict dietary concerns. And Christine, and she still does, but read every label. And it just so happened out of all the goodies and all the treats at Disney World, these popsicles were something that our kids could eat, specifically Natalie could eat. And when it's 90 degrees and you're standing in line and there's ice cream everywhere but your kid can't have it, we really were thankful for those popsicles. So to this day, when I think of popsicles, there's also a video of Katie singing that if you might ask me one time, I'll show you, but she doesn't appreciate that. But I think of this. I think of Disney World and our trip to Disney World. What about when I say biscuits and gravy? I know I'm making you hungry. This is just wrong. Does anybody notice that, like for instance, I'm sorry, tangent here. I don't eat breakfast almost never. I just feel better with it. In fact, I usually try to delay my first meal of the day quite a while. But for some reason, Sundays, man, I am ready to eat the pew in front of me by 12:30. I don't know if anybody else has that weird appetite change just on Sunday. Biscuits and gravy, what do you think of? I think of backpacking. What? This is going to make some of you so sad. That is John Banks. You guys have heard. It's been a long time. I should be over that by now. That's John Banks, a good friend of ours who's now with the Lord. But we went backpacking. It was his first time where he went backpacking. And he broke out one morning that package of biscuits and gravy, which is freeze-dried biscuits and gravy, and he just poured hot water, and he was so proud. And I'm like, that is like eating wet cement. I do not know. That is not what I call biscuits and gravy. In fact, you could say that might be blasphemy to call that. But biscuits and gravy, and Christine enjoys biscuits and gravy, and I don't even personally enjoy biscuits and gravy, but she does, and every time she orders it, I think of backpacking with John Banks. All right, a couple more. One more. What about when I say pie? What do you think of when I say pie? And some of you students, especially 3.14, blah, 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 you got the math going on in your head, right? What do you think of when I say pie? I think of shopping. Specifically, I think of the lack of shopping. So years ago, my mother and my sisters, they would do the whole Black Friday thing. So the day after Thanksgiving, they would get up really early, and it was a big event. They'd go get coffee together, and they'd go hit the crowds to get all the deals. And Christine and I were just sitting back thinking, that sounds awful. Not just shopping, but shopping in crowds. Ugh, right? So what did we come up with? We came up with Pie Friday. So now our tradition, family tradition, for quite a few years is every Friday after Thanksgiving, Christine always makes more pies than we need for Thanksgiving, and we eat pie for breakfast, pie for lunch, and pie for dinner. Pie Friday. Some of you are like, that's a great idea, right? There's other things I want to mention. I don't have pictures for them, and I'll take that off. Katie's going to be mad at me for having that picture up there. There's other things. When I say peanut M&Ms, what do you think of? I think of driving. My dad, for as long as I can remember, any road trip, any family trip, there was always a bag of peanut M&Ms, and he'd sit there and munch on them as he drove. When we moved up here, 14 hours drive, well, Christine went with the kids. I drove from Texas here straight, 14 hours. One of those big, massive, like, what is it, a 5-pound bag? Finished it. Finished it. It's not recommended. Not recommended. What about when I say green beans? What do you think of when I say green beans? There's a purpose to all this nonsense, I promise. I think of the biggest whooping I've ever had in my life. Some of those faces just went, huh? I hate green beans. When I was little, for about a month before my mom caught me, I would pick a certain chair at the dinner table because there was one of those heating vents on the floor behind me. Whoop! Whoop! Just drop those green beans down the heating vent until I got caught. The biggest whooping of my life. Because she had no idea how many green beans were now in the heating vent. And I did have to go spelunking to find those green beans. Last one, sweet corn. If you're not from Indiana, you may not even just sweet corn, sweet creamed corn specifically. Now we're really getting hungry. I think of milk cartons. The paper ones, the paper milk cartons, because my grandma, who made, and you can argue, we will fight over this, made the best cream corn the planet's ever seen. My grandma Harrison would take those milk jugs, the half gallons, and she'd cut them in half, and she'd take the bottom and she'd fill it with the sweet corn, and she'd cut it so she could fold it over and be and she'd tape it with just plain old masking tape, and she would freeze it that way. And we found a thing of sweet corn at the bottom of the freezer, and this is not an exaggeration, that was 18 years old, and we ate it, and it was delicious. There's some magical properties in that milk carton, right? My point. You've got your stories. Maybe one of those foods triggered a story, triggered a memory, I don't know. Maybe there's something else. And food is an interesting thing, that it can be just basic fuel. It can be just basic fuel, like camping. When I go camping, I do not get the camp stove out. It's beef jerky, it's tortillas with peanut butter, I never stoop to MREs. That's for those military people. But it's just fuel, right? But food can also be a celebration, it can be a feast, it can be ceremonial. There's all these ways that food connects us to memories, but it connects us to each other. Because what makes a meal significant? It's almost always the people that you're sitting down and eating with. That one makes a meal significant. I don't know. I spend more time as I get older wondering what my kids are going to remember about their childhood. Sometimes, and I'm very serious about this, sometimes fearing what they're going to remember, because I'm not a perfect parent. Sort of concerned about what damage am I doing to my children. And that's not a joke. I worry about those things. I do my best with God's grace to fix those things. But I wonder what they're going to remember, what the memories are going to be. Because I think back and I have my memories and my triggers. I will promise, and you're all going to love this picture. I'm just waiting for the awes. I know for a fact, though, no matter what, they're going to remember cooking with Mom. I think that's a health code violation, having your bare feet on the counter. But they're going to remember cooking with Mom. They're going to remember being in the kitchen. They're going to remember the food that Mom makes. That later, when we're long gone and they're making something that their mom made them for their kids, those memories are going to come flooding back. Because food is a powerful connector. And not just the food, but it's because of the people that you're reminded of from those meals, from those events, from that sitting down around the table. And Abe has done a great job of leading us through sitting at the table with Jesus and showing that. In fact, the Gospel of Luke is often referred to as the dinner gospel. There's all these meals over and over and over. Go ahead and turn to Exodus 12, where Scott read for us. We see throughout Scripture that God uses food, and specifically these specific meals, so many times to help bring to mind as a way to remember, as a way to celebrate, as a way to stay connected to what He's done. I don't know that there's any bigger example of that than Exodus 12. There's a lot of examples, but Exodus 12, where God's using the Passover. We're going to read what Scott read again, but we're going to read just a few verses ahead of that. I just want you to see the detail that God gets into, or some of the preparation. Look at chapter 12, Exodus chapter 12, verse 8. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread. They're talking about the lamb, roasting it with fire, and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs, along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left, but whatever is left of it until morning, you shall burn with fire. No leftovers. Now, some kids, yay, no leftovers. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that. I'm serious. Now you shall eat it in this manner, verse 11, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So he gives them details on how to prepare it, how to eat it. You're not going to have leftovers. Make sure you burn whatever's left and eat it this way, this ready to travel, ready to leave, right? So he's very specific. Now notice, and this is where Scott read. Go ahead in verse 21. So after giving this instruction to Moses, Moses goes to the people. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families and slay the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is on the basin to the lintel and the two doorsteps. And none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, and the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. And you shall observe this event in an ordinance for you and your children forever. And when you enter the land which the Lord will give to you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed down low and worshipped. So here we have this meal that they're going to take, and they're going to use every generation, every year. Generation after generation, is when they're in the land, they're supposed to observe this and go through all of this. And think about that. That's going to be, there's some people who started partaking of that, and for year after year, they physically remembered killing the lamb, taking the blood, putting it over the door, sitting inside the house. They remember hearing and knowing about the screams that night and the next day when all the firstborn in Egypt, even from the throne down to the servant to the cattle to everything, was killed. And with a mighty hand, they were ones walking with their belongings into the wilderness and through the Red Sea, and they watched Pharaoh's army be obliterated. There were people who heard this instruction, and the next few years, when they were doing these things, they remembered specifically being there. But the vast majority of people throughout the centuries who have observed the Passover never saw those things. They didn't rush out in the night. They didn't cross the Red Sea. They didn't run for their lives. But God designed it that way so that those people who hadn't been there, specifically, he says, the children, would look and see all this funny business going on with that lamb, and what are you doing, and why are you dressed like that, and all these things. And God says, they're going to say, what are you doing? What does this mean to you? And this meal that once a year that you come together and you partake of in a specific way with the people around you that share that belief and that trust in God, that meal is going to bring up those memories of what God did for you. That great and mighty deed. And we see all the way back in Luke chapter 22. Go ahead and turn in Luke chapter 22. 21, we see all the way up to when Jesus was with his disciples that they are still remembering what God did when he smote the Egyptians and passed over the children of Israel. Luke 21. I'm going to read a big section here. You'll notice that this starts with Judas going to the Pharisees and the leadership and deciding, okay, I'm going to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus. You see Jesus sending disciples to prepare for the Passover. Then you see some of the discussion at the table. Okay, so that's what we're going to read. What I want you to do is I want you to think about where are the people's, I want to say mentality. I don't know if that's the right word. What are people thinking about in this section? What's Jesus thinking about? What are his disciples concerned with? What's Judas thinking about? Okay? Chapter 21, we're going to read verses 1 through probably all the way down through 24. And he looked up and saw the rich putting, oh, that's not it. Am I in the right spot? 22, thank you. I said 22, didn't I? And then I corrected myself. My notes said 21. Correct that now. Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it. 22. Now the feast of the unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put him to death, for they were afraid of the people. And Satan entered into Judas, who was called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12, and he went away and discussed with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. They were glad and agreed to give him money, so he consented and began seeking a good opportunity to betray him to them apart from the crowd. Then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, so that we may eat it." And they said to him, "Where do you want us to prepare it?" And he said to them, "When you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house that he enters. And you shall say to the owner of the home, or to the house, 'The teacher says to you, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large furnished upper room. Prepare it there." And they left and found everything just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. And when the hour had come, he reclined at the table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I shall never again eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he said, "Take this and share it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until the kingdom of God comes." And when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, he took the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup, which is poured out for you, is the new covenant in my blood. But behold, the hand of the one betraying me, but behold, the hand of the one betraying me is with mine on the table. For indeed, the Son of Man is going as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." And they began to discuss among themselves which one of them it might be who was going to do this thing. And there arose also a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be the greatest. Did you pick up on where different people, different participants in this Passover meal, where their heads are at? All right, you've got Judas, who I'm sure is sitting there and contemplating and figuring and trying to, okay, when's a good time? Now's not a good time. Listening for clues, maybe. Wondering, okay, what's next? And you sort of see him, and as we progress in the story, which we're not going to get to, he sort of figures it out. Okay, he's going to go pray in this place where I know he's going to pray. So Judas, that's where his mind's at. Okay, I'm looking for that opportunity. What about the other disciples? Well, we know, and again, this wasn't just a simple 10-minute meal. They were thinking about a lot of stuff, but we know for a fact, and we see a repeated a repeated thinking that they continue to struggle with or have. Who's the greatest? So they're sitting there. So Judas is looking for opportunity to betray. The rest are sitting there wondering, okay, well, who's the greatest? And all that's involved with that. Where's Jesus' head at? Do you notice in verse 15? And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Now, Jesus and his disciples had eaten a lot of Passovers. So even without what we know is about to happen, what Jesus brings up, where should their heads be at? What was the purpose of the Passover, right? I mean, even without the Jesus part of this, they should be thinking about what God did for the nation and how he passed over the Israelites and he brought judgment upon the Egyptians, and with a mighty hand he led them out of Egypt and out of their captivity, and that's where their mind should be going, even without Jesus. But now with Jesus there, where's his mind? His mind's on just a little while later when he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be tried, and he's going to be crucified. And he turns to them and he says, I have earnestly desired. That's a strong word. That word desire, that earnestly desired, is translated lust in some places. You could have translated, it would have sounded weird, but I lusted to eat this meal with you, this Passover. Jesus, knowing the context, go ahead and turn to John 13, and we're not going to, Abe did a great job touching on this. I think he's got another lesson where he's going to go to John 13 more extensively, so we're just going to touch on this a little bit. But look where Jesus' head is at. John 13 gives us even more. So in Luke 22, he has this earnest, this strong desire to eat this meal with them before they suffer. Look how he describes it in John chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who are in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from the Father and was going back to God, got up from supper. You can also look at verse 21 real quick. When Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, Truly, truly, I say to you, the one who will betray who will betray me. Where's Jesus' head? Look at verses 1 through 4 of chapter 13 there in John. There's a lot going on. I mean, yes, there's this imminent departure, which I love that word. I believe it's Luke's account of the transfiguration. You need to fact check me on this. That word is where Moses and Elijah are speaking to him about his departure. I love how that word is just, we know what that departure involves. It's not just, hey, see you next week. It's not, well, the car's loaded. Got my airline tickets, got my license to get on the plane. It's not just what we think about that is heavy on his mind. What he's physically and emotionally and mentally going to have to go through, that's heavy on his mind. But his disciples are on his mind as well. Those he has loved, he's loved them to the end, knowing that it's not just his pain and his suffering, but his departure means a lot to those disciples. And he's got plans and they've got work to do, and it's not going to be an easy job. And he's sitting there thinking about what's going to happen when he's gone. And he's also got that betrayal on his mind. Did he love Judas any less? Did he love Judas any less? So Jesus is at the table, remembering the Passover, thinking about God's mighty hand, God's deliverance. Jesus is thinking about his part in that massive plan of deliverance. Concerned about his disciples, concerned about Judas, thinking of his suffering. And Judas is looking for an opportunity to betray him. The disciples are arguing about who's the greatest. And this is where I go on for the next 5 minutes and beat up on the disciples and beat up on Judas. And how could they do that? Except for the fact that would be hypocritical. Because we look at those things and we look at Judas and how could he spend that time with Jesus? And you don't have to raise your hand, but maybe I'll feel better if you do. We think about how could he spend all that time with Judas and still betray him, and we just can't fathom that. But how many times have I been an enemy to the cross? How many times is the life that I live and the decisions I make and the action I take rebel against Jesus and who He is? Knowing perfectly well who Jesus is, and I decide to say, that doesn't matter, I'm going to do my own thing. And with a group this size, as we approach the table together, there are probably people that are right there right now. Where you're here because you feel like you should be, you're here because mom and dad are here, you're here because some friends are here, and I'm glad you're here, but you're just thinking about the next time you get to do your thing or what you did yesterday, or there's no heart here. And then we jump on the disciples and go, okay, how in the world, after hearing and seeing and doing all, can you sit there and argue about who's the greatest? Why is that what's most important? Did you not just hear the Lord said, I've earnestly desired to eat this with you before I suffer? Do you not realize what's on His plate? But yet, how many times in my day-to-day life, in my day-to-day service, even working in among you wonderful people, am I driven by what I want and what's best for me and what my desires are? The reality is that when you look at what Jesus wanted, in Luke 22, what does He say? Do these things remembering me. Remembering my sacrifice. Then if you continue in John 13, we're not going to read that, but look at verse 4. He got up from supper, laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself, and he proceeds to wash feet. The lowest job of any servant, a job that had been neglected when they came in. A lot of these points Abe talked about last week. And he lowers himself, and you even see from his disciples' reaction that in their minds that was too low. So what does Jesus want as we approach the table? He wants us to remember, and He wants us to think about each other. Direct contrast of looking for opportunity to betray and looking for who's the greatest. He wants us to think about His sacrifice, and in thinking about His sacrifice, how do we look at each other? How can I sacrifice? Go ahead, and we're going to finish up in 1 Corinthians 11. 1 Corinthians 11. Again, if you've been born and raised, going to church, you've heard 1 Corinthians 11 many, many times as we approach the table. I want to just highlight a couple of things. Let's go ahead and read the text. We're going to pick up in verse 17 of chapter 11, and we'll read all the way down to verse 33. But in giving this instruction, I do not praise you because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each of you takes his own supper first, and one is hungry and another is drunk. Wait, what? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you. So I'm going to break there, because let's just think about what the problem is. The problem is, specifically, is they're not waiting for each other. That some those who have are going ahead and eating. Some, the have-nots are left without. There's sort of favoritism going on. There's hierarchy, it seems to be. Most importantly, they're thinking only about themselves and not about others. Is that any different than the disciples wondering who's the greatest? Is it any different than Judas looking for opportunity to betray? It's the same seed, isn't it? It's the same root. It's me. It's me. Look what Paul decides to remind them about in order to address this. Verse 23. For I received from the Lord that which I delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which He was betrayed, took bread, and when He had given thanks, He broke it and said, This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, He took the cup also after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the blood and the body of the Lord. But a man must examine himself, and in so doing, he is to eat the bread and drink the cup. For he who eats and drinks judgment to himself if he does not judge the body rightly. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number sleep. But if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord, so that we will not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. Just a couple of observations. Look at verse 26. Look at verse 26. For as often, now again, you see this, that he's reiterating what we've already talked. Jesus' plea is to take this bread, take this cup, and remember me. Remember his sacrifice, his death. Verse 26. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. You proclaim the Lord's death. I hope that you immediately, when you read that, think back to Exodus 12. Because what was the point of doing this rite, of going through these things, preparing the lamb, preparing the bread, and doing these things? It says so that when your children see it, they can say, what does this mean to you? They were proclaiming the Lord's salvation. They were proclaiming God's Passover. They were proclaiming it for people to see. It's the same thing we're doing. When we partake together, we are proclaiming his death. You picture this morning a little child saying, what does this mean to you? We're proclaiming. Go ahead and look at verse 27. Therefore, whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner. Now that we could fill that up. I could start taking hands and say, what's that mean to you? Well, it means I've lived a sinful week. Or you hear all sorts of things. My heart's not in it. What's it mean in the text? What's the unworthy manner described in the text? Go back to verse 17 and on. The unworthy manner is how they're looking at each other, how they're thinking about each other, how they're putting themselves above each other. How they're not focused on serving, but they're focused on being served. Every Sunday when we come together, yes, our focus is on what the Lord's done for us. But look at John 13. Where was his focus? Yeah, he says, remember me, but he also then remember me by lowering yourself, serving each other, seeing and taking care of the needs of one another, taking on the lowest job if that's what's needed to be done. Do as the teacher does. Verse 28. But a man must examine himself, and in so doing, he's to eat the bread and drink the cup. I want you to take a moment and just think about your brothers and sisters here. Think about your relationship. Yeah, I think there's a lot of examining we can go on, but in the context, he's encouraging them to examine themselves in light of how they're treating each other. We say examine yourselves, and that takes on, in this context, a negative connotation, but if you're examining yourself properly, there's a lot of people out there who should be thinking about all the opportunities you've had to serve, and how others have served you, and how your needs have been met, and how you've been able to meet other people's needs. And that's the idea of the body, is as we partake of this table, of this meal that represents the sacrifice God made, we are then bearing his image and sacrificing for each other. So examine yourselves. Verse 29, he says, for he who eats and drinks judgment to himself if he does not judge the body rightly. That's not just judging the body that Christ put on the cross. Because in this context, the body, the whole beginning of the conversation is they aren't judging the body rightly. They're not looking at each other the way Christ looked at them. So are we judging the body rightly? Do we think of each other? Do we consider each other? Drop down to verse 33. Do we wait for one another? That's not just about time, is it? It's not just about being patient. It's about considering the needs of each other. Considering what's best for one another. It's serving like Jesus served. If I can have the men come up who are going to help with the table, I would appreciate that. As they come up, just a couple closing thoughts for us to consider as we partake. We're coming to the table with Jesus. As we've come to the table with Jesus, He has asked us to remember His sacrifice. Take a moment and consider that bread that's going to be passed out. Don't just grab it and toss it. Consider what that bread represents. Feel it in your fingers. And take a moment to consider what Jesus' body endured to be our lamb. Where Israel put the blood on the lintel so that they would pass over and their firstborn would be safe, God gave us His firstborn to be crucified so that our sins could be passed over. When you partake of that cup, look at that cup. Look at the dark, rich red. Consider the blood that was poured out from His hands, His head, His feet, His side, the skin on His back. Consider the blood. The cost of my sin, the cost of your sin. And then last but not least, and maybe even most importantly in Jesus' mind, consider each other. Consider those who have served you and say, God, thank you for the body who has helped me so many ways. Consider those you have the opportunity to serve and say, thank you, God, for the body and the energy and the resources I have to serve. Consider one another as you partake. Because when Jesus came to the table with His disciples, even though they were all over the place, He was focused on His suffering, remembering His suffering, remembering His death, and He was focused on serving others. And every time we come to the table, yes, we think about Jesus, but in thinking about Jesus, we think about each other. And that service to each other is how we show glory and honor to our King who suffered on our behalf.